statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. We're grateful to Mark Lowcock for his briefing and his perspective on the humanitarian situation in Syria. We'd also like to thank Ms. Sonia Kush for her briefing too. I would also like to greet and welcome the new permanent representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to the UN today too. Unfortunately, the briefing of the humanitarian coordinator did not contain all the factors that link to the humanitarian situation in Syria. For example, we did not hear, amongst the reasons for the deteriorating economic situation in Syria, the unlawful unilateral restrictions of our Western colleagues. Also, it is in fact these sanctions that don't allow the economic situation in Syria to turn a corner, despite all the efforts of the government. And it is mainly normal Syrians who are suffering from this. They desperately need access to adequate social services for healthcare and education, as well as rebuilding the war-torn civilian infrastructure. The humanitarian assistance that reaches the country is not solving these problems, won't not solve these problems, and it is not normalizing Syrians' lives, nor are the humanitarian exemptions working. And we can hear this directly from humanitarian workers working on the ground. We've spoken on several occasions about the relevant conclusions of the UN Special Rapporteur on the impact of sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights. On the basis of her conclusions, at the end of January this year, President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson received a joint letter with more than 90 signatures with a request to lift sanctions against Syria. The signatories included not only representatives of academia and religious groups, but journalists, humanitarian workers, but also former envoys of the UK, Germany, Tunisia, and France to Syria, and also a current member of the House of Lords of the UK. In this letter, it clearly states, and I quote, that humanitarian and human rights spheres, that it has a consensus that this form of collective punishment of civilians, including sanctions, is bringing Syria towards an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, end of quote. Because of the impact of sanctions, Damascus cannot run its stock exchange, which is so necessary for the economy to function. It can't buy raw materials and building materials abroad, not even to mention medication and medical equipment, which is so necessary in the context of a pandemic. We hope that the OCHA is aware of this. President, as we know, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, Gavi, gave positive consideration to 2 applications for Syria to receive COVID vaccines. One application was sent by the government. We are convinced that part of the vaccines received through Damascus will also be directed to the territories not controlled by the government in the northeast, as was the case with the delivery of medical assistance last year. I'd recall that since May 2020, with the consent of Damascus, 6 land convoys with medications were sent to the area east of the Euphrates, as well as 3 medical deliveries delivered to Kamishli by air. More than 90% of all of this assistance went to territories not controlled by the government, to all medical institutions which were previously supplied across the Al Yaroubi crosspoint, and there's more than 100 of these. At the same time, we've not heard a single time from our Western partners in the Council any positive assessments of these efforts by Damascus, much like we've not heard a single word of condemnation against the terrorists who control Idlib. And for almost a year now, they have not allowed humanitarian convoys from the UN and the Red Crescent and the Red Cross in to the enclave. And this, at the same time, this area of the country, the UN has noted the largest number of people going hungry. 1 in 3 of these is a child. And food prices in Idlib are 26% higher than the national average. Generally, is it not time for us to ask ourselves the question, what is happening in Idlib? Why, at a time when we have record deliveries across the cross-border mechanism of humanitarian assistance, it is in the northwest, which has one of the highest numbers of starving people. Where has all of this aid spent with millions of dollars from Western donors disappeared to? One thing is clear, that terrorists in Idlib are getting richer. At the same time, we've never heard, and we clearly won't hear, any requests from donor countries to the UN to report back on results achieved from the work that they've done. As it would appear, in Idlib, some of this mechanism is being squirreled away. And there's no doubt that keeping the cross-border mechanism will also mean supporting terrorists who are living on what they've extorted and also on how they're controlling smuggling. In these circumstances, Syrians can only be satisfied with the crumbs from the table of these plunderers. They can't earn their own living and even eke out the most meagre existence for their children. In this connection, we'd be interested to know how fairly will the vaccines be distributed in the northwest and from Gavi reserves. And the UN office in Gaziantep has already expressed concern about this. The representative of France and the US, the chargé d'affaires of the US, the deputy permanent representative of the US, proposed us to exert pressure on the Syrian authorities so that they can carry out vaccinations in Syria, as if Damascus was refusing to do so. Here again, we can't skirt the issue of sanctions, which could seriously undermine Damascus' efforts to organise the delivery of vaccines to the government-controlled territories and then to store them later. What logistical companies that you have heard of would run the risk of falling foul of sanctions? How can the government ensure unhindered energy supply to the country so that the cooling facilities for these vaccines can run if they can't buy the necessary equipment and spare parts abroad? President, our grievances against the US are not going anywhere either. They are occupying the northeast of Syria and they are pocketing the oil resources of the country. There's a deafening silence about this literally toxic subject, and it is casting a shadow on the authority not only of our partners in the Security Council, but is also calling into question their commitment to the territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, as is confirmed in Resolution 2254. Thanks to Russian military, a corridor was freed up to deliver humanitarian assistance to the region of Haseka. And what are these champions of humanism, the US, doing to resolve the humanitarian situation in Syria? President, to summarize today's statement, I would like to say in all seriousness that if we all had to make a decision on the extension of the cross-border mechanism tomorrow, I fear that we wouldn't have any convincing grounds to do so. But everyone who's interested in extending the work of the cross-border mechanism needs to understand that there's not much time to do so, and we have a lot of things to do. Here, it is important not only to ensure that Syrian deliveries of assistance can reach Idlib, but ensure that it becomes a permanent delivery. In conclusion, I will go back to our questions to Mark Lowcock. Before I do that, I'd like to say that we were surprised by the statement of our American colleague as regards the alleged fact that we did not allow a briefer to attend today's meeting. We have nothing personal against this briefer, but we thought that one representative of civil society would be sufficient, particularly given that the briefer you suggested today. And I'd like to recall that recently our American colleagues hindered the attendance of briefers at the council that the Russia requested. Now, I'd like to request Mark partially answered some of the questions that we asked, and there were 4 questions. And from the questions that we haven't covered, it is what obstacles are there for the implementation of work in Syria of the so-called development of humanitarian workers? And if there are obstacles, then where are they from? And what can we do to overcome them? Finally, last question that we haven't heard a response to is on the question of the task force on Syria, interagency task force. What is the difference between that and the UN country team? Who's the membership and what functions does it have? Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his